Grandma Glenna makes her signature German chocolate cake every year for little Calix's birthday. This year, little Calix is gonna have 27 candles on top of the 3 rich, chocolatey layers, pecans, and coconut. Every year, pecans get a little more pricey though, and coconut ain't as cheap as it used to be. Even butter prices are starting to climb. Altogether, Grandma Glenna's grocery basket costs over $10 more than when her precious grandson only had 3 candles on his cake. Grandma Glenna's experiencing something many of us consumers know well: rising prices. Thankfully, her fixed income is rising too, thanks to cost of living adjustments by the government. That's because the policymakers pay pretty close attention to how much money consumers have to spend on basics like groceries, clothing, and household appliances. In fact, keeping track of how much average stuff costs for average people is an important part of economic health and policy. But economists and government policymakers can't just go peering into grandma's grocery basket, right? Actually, they sort of can. Hi, I'm Matt Sofa, and this is Study Hall, Macroeconomics. The amount you need to spend to maintain your lifestyle is known as your cost of living. It includes the necessities like food, water, shelter, education, transportation, and medical care, plus some fun little extras like 8 million streaming services or concert tickets to see Bono and U2 at the Sphere. Many things can influence cost of living, like inflation, shifts in supply and demand, or improvements in technology. And to understand what's going on with these changes on a macro scale, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, spends a lot of time analyzing not only the stuff Grandma Glenna is buying, but common purchases by residents all over the country. To do this, the BLS comes up with a list of really average stuff that really average people are buying, tallies up the prices, and comes up with a nifty number that tells roughly how prices are changing. This is known as the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. CPI can trace its history back to the original food price index circa 1903. Then, during World War I, wartime inflation meant that suddenly stuff was costing way more than before, and the US government wanted to understand how much more average consumers were spending to get not only food on their table, but clothes on their backs and roofs over their head. They picked 1913 as the base year, or the year to scale current prices. Of course, a lot has changed over the last century, and current CPI is compared to a base year in the early 1980s instead, usually between 1982 and 1984. But CPI isn't just useful for comparing current prices to the era of Reagan, neon leggings, and John Hughes movies. Looking at the CPI for 2024 compared to 2020 gives us an idea about how much prices have risen in those 4 years too. CPI is then used to calculate adjustments to government support programs like Social Security. If it looks like the cost of living is going to go up, the government can add a cost of living increase to Social Security checks so Grandma Glenna can keep buying those pecans. CPI can also be used to adjust minimum wage by giving the government an idea of how much per hour a worker would have to make in order to support themselves working full time. That's known as a living wage. Sometimes private employers will also add cost of living increases to employee paychecks too. But unfortunately, as of 2024, federal minimum wage in the US is still lagging far behind the calculated living wage. When the BLS goes about finding the CPI, they don't calculate the prices of all goods purchased by all households. To keep things simple, they work off of a select group of 80,000 specific commonly purchased goods and services each month, known as the market basket. When Grandma Glenna was a girl in the 1950s, it included things like eggs, milk, toilet paper, and movie tickets. But every so often, the BLS will update the market basket to keep up with current trends. So today's market basket also includes stuff like airline tickets and smartphones. And just like it focuses in on specific goods for the market basket, the BLS focuses on specific households too, those that they feel are representative of the US average. And while we know there's no such thing as a typical family, the BLS focuses on those living in urban and suburban areas because statistically about 90% of the US population is hanging in or around cities. But when it comes to actually calculating CPI, it's a little more complicated than just waiting in line at your local Stop and Shop for the cashier to ring up your total. The first step the BLS takes to draw up that precious CPI is to fix the basket, or decide what kinds of goods and services to include and how to weigh them. They survey households in those urban and suburban areas using shopping diaries where families record everything they buy. The BLS then takes the most common items people record and sorts them into 8 major groups: food and beverage, housing, apparel, transportation, medical care, recreation, education and communication, and the generic other, which includes everything from tobacco to haircuts. You probably aren't surprised that US consumers spend the most on housing, food, and transportation, so they make up the biggest percentages of the market basket, and have the most weight when we go to calculate our total. But the BLS still has to find the prices of all those basket items. They survey thousands of vendors to see how much these items cost. And after they fix the basket with their lists of goods and services to determine the average prices, the BLS can whip out their calculator and find the CPI. Like we mentioned, CPI is calculated by comparing the cost of a market basket for a base month, given month in the base years between 1982 and 1984. When it comes to CPI, it's all about that base. This works great for a lot of 80s trends that just keep coming back into style. I'm looking at you, mom jeans and mullets. But can be tough for things like the cost of monthly streaming subscriptions or an Apple Watch, because those things weren't around back in the day. Those items use a different base month, one from the post-Blockbuster era. To find out if price levels have changed from the base month to a given month, we divide the cost of the basket from the month we want to know about by the cost of the basket in the base month, and then multiply it by 100. To keep it simple, let's say the beautiful hamlet of Genovia only has 2 things in its market basket: mustache combs, 8 Genovian francs each, and Tamagotchis, 20 Genovian francs each, with mustache combs making up 60% of the basket and Tamagotchis coming in at 40%. So 60 mustache combs at 8 Genovian francs and 40 Tamagotchis at 20 Genovian francs makes the market basket for the current month 1,280 Genovian francs. Let's compare that to the base month of November 1984. Now, that's all well and good for mustache combs, but Tamagotchis didn't hit the market until 1996, so we gotta pick a different base month for that particular good. Let's say the year of our Lord, Prince himself, 1999. And boy, are we gonna party good. Now, let's say that this market basket was weighted the same back in the day, with 40% of purchases being Tamagotchis and 60% being mustache combs. But those vintage prices were pretty different. Tamagotchis were actually 18 Genovian francs in 1999, while mustache combs were even less expensive back in the 80s at 6 Genovian francs. We can calculate the CPI by taking the cost of the basket in our current month and dividing it by our base month basket. Finally, we multiply it by 100 and voila! You've got yourself a CPI. Now we can compare them. The CPI in the base month is always 100, while in 2023 it was nearly 119. According to this very strange hypothetical, prices have risen about 19% for the people of Genovia. But while CPI does a pretty good job pinpointing how the cost of living has changed over time, it isn't perfect. Like, if you're at the grocery store shopping for a dinner party, maybe prosciutto prices have been climbing faster than fruit or cheese, so you bypass the bougie meat section and opt for more dried apricots to fill out your famous charcuterie board. This is called the substitution bias. As in, the BLS is biased against you subbing in your own cheaper alternatives to whatever products or prices they have in their fixed market basket. Another pesky human behavior that BLS struggles to factor into their fixed basket of goods is the introduction of new goods. Maybe you used to buy regular milk, but since Oatly released their Barista Blend oat milk, now you've become fully converted. New goods diversify the market and give consumers even more options besides what's tracked in the market basket. Further complicating things is the fact that new goods that burst onto the scene tend to be pricier than the old standbys, and the price slowly decreases over time. So when the BLS finally does include a new good, it enters into the market at a higher price than it usually ends up settling into. There are also unmeasurable changes in quality that CPI, being a quantitative measure, has a hard time capturing. Technology, like fine wine, improves with time, and things like storage and battery life hit new levels without the item really changing significantly in price. You're getting more bang for your buck, if you will, and CPI unfortunately hasn't totally figured out how to calculate bang. For its part, the BLS has been making vast improvements to address these biases. Since 1999, they've been trying to factor in consumer behavior due to rising prices to account for the substitution bias, but only within categories. For example, If you'd chosen to sub your prosciutto for some more budget-friendly salami, CPI could have predicted and accounted for that. But since you jumped categories over to dried fruit, not so much. They've also begun to update the basket more frequently to include new goods quicker than before. But still, when a trendy new alternative milk takes the world by storm, the market basket is a little bit like your parents, 2 steps behind every trend. All this skews the CPI slightly upwards, meaning it overestimates the cost of living. Economists bicker back and forth, but as of 2023, the current and highly contested estimate is that CPI is off about 0.5% a year, which may not seem like a lot, but every fraction of a percentage counts when you're an economist dealing with huge national economies over decades. Still, CPI is pretty darn good at answering the question, what does stuff cost compared to the previous month? This straightforwardness is what makes it the German chocolate cake of price indexes. That is to say, the best. But there are, of course, other ways of measuring changing price levels, like our old friend, the GDP deflator. One huge difference between these two handy price indexes is what goods and services they consider when drawing up their calculations. Since the GDP deflator is based on GDP, which only measures domestic goods and services, it doesn't account for any money spent on imports, while the CPI absolutely includes imported goods as part of their market basket. On the other hand, the GDP deflator covers all domestic goods, even really niche ones like chicken harnesses or mustache combs. Meanwhile, the CPI has a fixed basket of only the most common goods, but it includes imported stuff like fancy French cheese. But as you can see, even though CPI and the GDP deflator check in on price rates in different ways, they pretty much always follow one another as prices spike and dip. So we can feel pretty good that despite these drawbacks, these measures are giving us accurate information we can use to make purchasing choices, and the government can use to bump up those checks. There are so many moving parts to a national economy. To keep track of all of them, economists try to use systems, formulas, models, and hypotheticals to measure complicated, unpredictable, and sometimes illogical human behavior. But these tools can only give us so sharp a picture when it comes to how things actually go down. What is clear, though, is that changes in price levels are a top concern for everyone, from economists to policymakers to businesses to Grandma Glenna herself. Understanding how all of this is measured and the flaws in those measurements helps us get a better sense of where we are as consumers in our global economy. From what's included in your country's market basket to whether or not you can afford pecans and coconut for your grandson's birthday, the CPI is used to track economy-wide price changes. Changes that affect us all. If you're enjoying this series and are interested in taking the full Study Hall Macroeconomics course and earning college credit from ASU, check out gostudyhall.com or click on the button to learn more. And if you want to help us out, give this video a like, comment, and smash that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. See you next time.